This was quite easily the closest that I've ever been to cardiac arrest, and considering some of the professions I've had, that's saying a bit. In mid-2004, I'd become newly separated from my wife, and decided that a getaway and a career change were in order. Call it a geographical cure, if you will, but it's a story for another time. I decided to move a couple of thousand miles from my home to attend a quick 4-month continuing education course in industry radiography and ultrasonics in Calgary, Alberta. I'd fared well in that course, and due to the oil boom happening in North America at the time, I was literally hired by a large company waiting outside the doors as we graduated from our educational endeavors. Taking the job entailed moving a further 800 miles into the north of Canada to be based out of a small town which serviced the surrounding oil fields. I had no idea what the place would be like and what I'd be in store for. At the time, the north of the Canadian prairies had taken all of the influx of workers that it could, and infrastructure didn't really grow with the boom. Trying to find a place to live up there was next to impossible. I am not at all stretching the truth when I say that people were renting their balconies for people to pitch their tents on in a couple of places. I kid you not. Some of the places that ended up being rented out weren't really even fit for human habitation. This was the Black Gold Rush. I overstayed my company chit in a hotel that they'd put me up in for a month, and was told that I had to find a place to live. It was absolutely next to impossible to find accommodations for a few reasons too. I was working between 12 to 20 hours a day, and the vacancy rate was less than 0%. I decided to look at some outlying communities then. I asked for a day off and ended up driving about an hour from our office and found a small farming community. I use the word community loosely here. This was a spattering of easily 60 to 100-year-old dilapidated houses centered around a greasy main street. A liquor store doubled as a post office, a bar doubled as a hotel, and the grocery store looked and smelled of a slaughterhouse that could have been condemned. It was Wild West shit. I drove by an old house that had been obviously divided into several apartments, and almost couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the orange and black for rent signs screaming out at me. My heart did sink a bit though. The place was clapboard, and the kind of dirty you can see before you even get out of your truck. At this point, after about a month of brutality on the pipelines of Alberta, I was exhausted and simply didn't care anymore. It was irony abound. I was making wicked money and could have afforded an uptown place, but because of the boom, I was going to be forced to live in a fucking ditch. Great. Again, I digress. I ended up taking an apartment in this building, but that's an abuse of the word apartment. This was a dive, beyond dives. They say that Alberta is rat-free, but I can testify that the statement is a crock of shit. And I don't mean just the variety of rodentia. The people living in this building could easily have qualified as something that had crawled out from the oil and grease-laden hulls of a ship, straight up the steps and into a pile of meth on a cheap fucking kitchen table. The place itself was enough then. It could have easily appeared on a YouTube channel. Carpets that were once grey were now an indescribable clay colour. Dirt rubbed into dirt, into an on-sale, off-tint paint, carelessly rubbed all over the place with a $1 brush. And boy, the smell. Think of unwashed hair, wrapped around rotten vegetables that have been thrown into a wet paper bag, and you're getting somewhere close. After sighing loudly and handing $2 fucking grand over to the landlord in cash, I took the place. Didn't have a choice, really. Besides, being exhausted, I knew I'd not get another day off anyway, and I was right. I worked from July to December 24th without one day off, bearing the day that I procured my glorious abode. I had arranged beforehand to get a bed from Sears that morning, and had it in the back of my truck. I dragged the queen mattress across the barroom of a kitchen floor, into a place that had been divided by 16th-inch wood panel into a bedroom. For the next 9 months, this would be my home. If the grubby kitchen table and one chair that were sitting in that place wouldn't have been included, the only thing in that place would have been that bed, and that would have been it, except for my alarm clock on the floor. So, the routine was get up at 4 a.m, drive, work like a coal miner until sunset, drive, drink whiskey, drop on my bed in my coveralls, rinse, repeat, and for 100 days, literally. But then, one Friday evening in October, I'd come home after a particularly brutal day of dragging my ass through the mud, and my feet finally hit my kitchen floor at around 11 at night, and I was in a mood, I tell ya. I sat down at the pissant kitchen table in my fire-retardant coveralls, covered in mud past my waist. I don't know if you've ever worked these kinds of hours in these kinds of conditions, but after a while, you just kind of stop caring about anything. I sat there and downed about a half pint of whiskey in a quarter pint of time, and smoked cigarette after cigarette, lit each one of the bastards with the last one I'd smoked. I knew I was in trouble with drinking and smoking, but as with most things, I just didn't give a shit. I'd become married again. Married to work, married to mud, married to the oil, married to the welding, the pipe, and married to the hours that turned me as dirty as the place I inhabited. After I'd finished hating on my body for about an hour, I noticed that it was past midnight, and I knew that I had to be up in 6 hours. That was considered our day off up there, and not working until 8 a.m. on the weekends. I crashed down onto my bed, a coverall still wrapped around my waist, a commando underneath. The rust scraper I carried to remove scale from welds before I x-rayed them still in my side pocket. I reached over and clicked the alarm button with a sigh. I remember thinking that I was pretty sure that none of this was worth the money. I was a shell of a human being. In those days, I'd often drift in and out of consciousness while trying to sleep. I'd be buzzed, overtired, and really just resting until the next onslaught of 100 welds. I remember that night, though, hearing a fair amount of scratching in the kitchen just past the partition that made the door to my room. At one point, I think I even took exception to it and grumbled a bit at it. The mice, rats, and roaches were louder than usual, and who knew what the fuck the crackheads were doing next door tonight. Then, I remember drifting off into a numbed, half-dreaming state. The scratching had finally stopped. I hadn't been laid in months and started into a semi-dream about a woman I'd seen earlier at a gas station in one of the nameless towns we'd passed through as a crew. And then, I saw her. Her shadowy form at the foot of my bed, and I smiled. But then, as my eyes slowly registered, half open, I realized that I was no longer dreaming, and that it wasn't a her, and that he was breathing loudly. He was standing at the foot of my bed, and as I froze in terror for what seemed to be about 15 seconds, he grabbed my foot. Lisa. He breathed out at me in a slurred, throated pitch that brought with it the smell of a chemical that managed to overshadow both the whiskey on my breath and the hovel smell that was the atmosphere I lived in. Now, I am not a huge guy, but when I get all kinds of freaked out, I'm pretty strong. I remember not even thinking, just reacting. I pulled the scraper from my side pocket and launched myself, rolling sideways off the bed, wrenching my foot from his grip. I don't think I've even hit the ground before I was on my feet, and I swung hard. I not only felt skull when that scraper connected with the front of his head, but I heard it scrape across the shadow. The next blur would have been comedic relief, had the situation not been what it was. He howled in pain and almost in a hurt feelings kind of way, because I was still half drunk and had launched myself at him like a linebacker practicing on the full height tackle, and my head went straight into the fucking wall near the edge of my door and sent me straight back into the bed. I hit fucking hard while hyper-intelligently yelling, "Ah!" I remember the sound of my scraper hitting the kitchen floor with a shitty sounding clang, and I remember the bright flash as I fell backwards, and right before I lost consciousness, I remember thinking, oh fuck, he's got me. And then I passed out. When I came to, I don't really know how much time had passed. I came back slowly, but as soon as I remembered what was going on, I made an attempt to leap back to my feet, and dizzy as a dog that's been beaten, might I add, I fell sideways onto my left arm and felt it crunch under my weight. I remember screaming, fuck, as loud as I could before I got back up and charged into the kitchen. I slammed the heel of my hand into the wall where the light switch was, flooding the greasy yellow light over the mess that was my kitchen. The front door was wide open, and I was standing in blood, and no one was there. I remember hearing scurrying behind the door across the hall from me though, like someone was trying to figure out what was going on in the cacophony that was my shithole apartment. I had a few lengths of pipe in the kitchen. They were 2 to 4 inch pieces of pipe cutouts, butt welded together as test welds. I'd brought them home as examples of weld defects to study. I grabbed a 2 inch diameter sample of the pipe that was about 3 feet long and ran at my front door. No one there. I don't really know how long I was out for in the bedroom, but as the realization that the intruder had fled crept onto me, so did the adrenaline leave me. I began shaking, dropped the pipe, and sat down on the floor right in my doorway. The chick who was living across the hall opened a door and asked if I was okay. I sat there, bare-chested, with muddy coveralls up to my waist, curly hair turned into Jimi Hendrix on a bad night, with blood from my forehead running across my face. I'm sure that I absolutely stunk, and stunk of the whiskey that had fucked me into my doorway. It was probably a classic YouTube moment, as I Jack Nicholson looked up at her with my pointy eyebrows, and sarcastically drawled out at her, "Does it look like I'm the fuck okay?" She just slowly closed her door, and probably figured that I was another oil-filled crackhead who'd gone off the rails for another holiday. What I saw then, though, really bothered me, almost more than the intrusion. The entire outer door frame had been removed from the outside of my entrance door. That guy had worked really hard to get in there. He had wanted in. He wanted in quietly, and whoever Lisa was, I'm certain that he hadn't intended her much good. Oddly, I remember feeling more nauseous about whoever that was, raping and doing God knows what to a stranger named Lisa, than I felt about the actual intrusion. I stood up, closed the door, and picked up the overturned kitchen chair, plunking down into it. Then, I almost puked across the kitchen table, and whatever drunk there was left in me suddenly dissipated. For one of the few times in my life, I was genuinely frightened, and I don't fright easily. I remember waiting a while before I called the cops. At that time, the RCMP were often few in number and overworked in those remote areas. They never even showed up until hours later, explaining that since I told them that he was no longer there, they felt I was safe. Later, when I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, face bloodied, left arm screaming in pain, someone else's blood on my hand, I remember wiping my hand across the mirror to try and get some of the grunge off the glass. I sat there and stared at the blood I left on the mirror for a good 10 minutes, and decided that my time in that town was now over. I called my boss when the sun came up and told him that he'd either be putting me back up in the hotel or I was driving the fuck south, and he could hire whatever deranged crackhead he wanted. He agreed, and so came the end of my tenure in Hines Creek.